The world for the farmer's wife was painted in the colors of dawn and dusk. It was a life that didn't follow a clock but followed the sun. Long before the first hint of light touched the horizon, she was already awake, moving through the quiet house with a practiced, silent grace. The floors were cool beneath her bare feet, and the only sounds were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft, sleepy breathing of her children down the hall. Her day began with the familiar ritual of making coffee, the rich, dark smell a small, personal luxury in a life built on practicality. Then it was out the door, into the cool, crisp air that smelled of damp earth and the distant. Sweet scent of hay. Her hands were her most important tools, and they told the story of her life better than words ever could. They were strong, with nails that were rarely clean and skin that was weathered from countless hours under the sun. There were small white scars on her knuckles from a slip of a kitchen knife or a run-in with a barbed wire fence. Her fingers knew the precise pressure needed to coax a stream of warm milk from a cow's udder. The gentle but firm tug needed to pull a stubborn weed from the garden, and the exact temperature of the water for washing a child's scraped knee without making them cry. These hands were not meant for delicate things, or so she had told herself for many years. They were hands that built and mended, that soothed and fed. They were the hands of a farmer's wife, and she was, in every sense of the word, content with that. To the people in the small town, she was a fixed point, as reliable as the old stone bridge over the creek. At the local market, where she sold her homemade jams and fresh eggs, people would greet her with a friendly nod. "Morning! How's Tom keeping?" they would ask, or "Your boy won the spelling bee, did you hear?" Smart kid, just like his father. They saw her as an extension of her family, a quiet, smiling presence who managed the home and supported her husband. They didn't see the woman who, while hanging laundry on the line, would sometimes hum a tune so complex and beautiful it seemed out of place against the backdrop of clucking chickens and the rumble of a distant tractor. They didn't know that her mind, while her hands were busy kneading dough for bread, would sometimes drift away to a world of concert halls and sheet music, a world she had left behind a lifetime ago. That other world was represented by a single object in her home, an old upright piano that stood in the corner of the living room. It had been a gift from her parents when she was a young girl, a shiny black beauty with keys as white as snow. Now it was a silent sentinel, covered by a fine layer of dust that softened its edges and made it blend into the background. On top of it, life had accumulated. There was a chipped ceramic vase filled with dried wildflowers, a stack of mail held down by a smooth river stone, and a framed photograph of her family on their last trip to the coast. The piano was no longer an instrument. It was a shelf. It was a piece of furniture that held the artifacts of her current life, effectively burying the ghost of her past one. The children would sometimes run their small fingers over the keys, pressing them down and laughing at the dull, thudding sounds they made, but they never asked their mother to play. To them, it was just a big, noisy box one afternoon. Her children came bursting through the back door, their faces flushed with excitement and waving a brightly colored piece of paper. It was a flyer for the annual town fair, and they jabbed their fingers at a section circled in red crayon. "Look, Mom! A talent show!" her daughter shouted, her voice full of hope. "You should do it. You can play the piano, can't you?" Her son chimed in, "Yeah, Miss Henderson says you were the best player ever when you were little." The question hit her like a physical blow. For a moment the world stopped. The sound of the television, the clatter of dishes in the sink, the birds chirping outside it all faded into a dull roar. She could feel her husband's eyes on her from across the room, a curious, gentle look on his face. He knew she had played, of course. It was something they had talked about when they were first courting, a story from her youth that seemed as distant and fantastical as a fairy tale. But he had never actually heard her play. Not once in all their years of marriage. A familiar ache spread through her chest, a feeling she kept locked away in the same dusty corner of her heart where she kept the memory of the piano. She saw a flash of herself as a teenager, her fingers flying across the keys, the music pouring out of her, filling the room with a passion and fire that she hadn't felt in years. She saw the dreams she once had, the path she almost took. But then, just as quickly, the image was replaced by the reality of her life, the tired but loving face of her husband, the hopeful eyes of her children, the mountain of laundry that needed to be done. She forced a smile, a gentle, sad curve of her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, that was a long, long time ago," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She took the flyer from her daughter's hand, pretending to study it intently. "My goodness, a pie baking contest. Now that's something. I think I have a winning recipe for apple pie." She deftly changed the subject. Her words a gentle diversion, redirecting their excitement to something safe, something that fit into the world they all knew. The children, easily distracted, began to talk about the possibility of a blue ribbon for pie. And the moment passed. Later that night, after the house was finally quiet and her husband was snoring softly beside her, she lay awake in the dark. The moon cast a pale, silvery light through the window, illuminating the corner of the room where the piano stood. From her bed, she could just make out its shape, a dark, hulking shadow. The silence in the room felt heavy, thick with the words she hadn't said, with the music she hadn't played. She closed her eyes, but she could still see it. And for the first time in a very long time, she wondered what it would feel like to lift the lid, to run her fingers over those dusty keys, and to remember the girl she used to be. The piano, and the part of her soul that was connected to it, remained silent, waiting. The moonlight spilled across the wooden floor, a silent, silver pathway leading from her bed to the corner of the room where the old piano stood. The house was deep in its sleeping rhythm, but her mind was wide awake, buzzing with the echoes of her children's excited voices and the question they had asked so innocently. "You can play the piano, can't you?" The words had unlocked a door in her heart that she had kept bolted shut for 20 years. A quiet restlessness settled over her, a feeling so unfamiliar it was almost uncomfortable. She couldn't just lie there and ignore it. Slowly, carefully, so as not to disturb the warm lump of her sleeping husband beside her, she swung her legs out from under the quilt. Her bare feet met the cool floorboards and she held her breath. Listening, nothing. The house was still. She moved like a ghost through her own home. Her steps light and practiced from years of moving about in the early morning hours. She passed the kitchen, where the morning's dishes were already stacked neatly by the sink, and through the living room, a space cluttered with the comfortable chaos of family life. There it was. The piano looked bigger in the dim light, a dark, silent beast guarding a secret. Her heart was thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. This felt foolish, a childish whim. What was she doing? She should be in bed, getting her rest for another long day of work. But her feet kept moving, drawn by an invisible thread. She reached out her hand, her fingers hovering just above the dusty lid. For a moment she hesitated, a war raging inside her between the practical woman she had become and the girl she used to be. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she let her hand rest on the wood. It was smooth and cool, and the dust felt like a fine powder against her skin. She lifted the lid. It moved with a soft, sighing creak, revealing the keys. They were yellowed with age, some with tiny hairline cracks, but they were still beautiful. A row of white islands in a sea of black. She stared at them, and a wave of something she hadn't felt in years washed over her, a sweet and sad ache for the past. She remembered the feel of these keys under her young, unblemished fingers, the way they felt like an extension of her own soul. Hesitantly, she sat down on the worn wooden bench. It gave a little groan under her weight, a small complaint in the quiet room. She lifted her hands, her farmer's hands, and looked at them in the moonlight. They were strong and capable, but they felt clumsy and awkward now. They were hands that knew the work of the earth, not the delicate dance of music. She wondered if they would even remember how her right index finger reached out and pressed a middle C. The sound that came out was not the clear, bell-like tone she remembered. It was a dull, thudding note, slightly off-key and muffled by years of silence and dust. It sounded lonely. She pressed another key, and then another, a simple three-note melody that sounded like a child's first attempt. A wave of disappointment washed over her. It was gone. The magic was gone. Her hands were too rough, her mind too full of grocery lists and farm chores. She was about to close the lid, to put this foolish idea to bed once and for all, when something made her lean down and lift the top of the piano bench. The smell hit her first, the dry, comforting scent of old paper and the hint of cedar from the wood. Inside, nestled in the dark, were stacks of sheet music. They were neat, organized, just as she had left them all those years ago. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the first one from the pile. The title was printed in elegant, faded black ink, Nocturnes by Chopin. She remembered this piece. She remembered the way her old professor, a stern man with a shock of white hair, had told her that a Chopin nocturne wasn't just music, it was a conversation with the moon. She flipped through the pages, her eyes tracing the familiar cascade of notes. Here and there, she saw faint pencil markings, her own handwriting from a lifetime ago, reminding her of a dynamic change or a tricky fingering. It was like finding a diary she had forgotten she'd written. As she held the music, the memories came flooding back, not as a gentle stream, but as a rushing river. She saw herself again, not as a farmer's wife, but as a young woman with a fire in her belly and a scholarship to a conservatory in the city. She could almost feel the cold marble floors of the practice rooms and hear the sounds of 100 other instruments being played all at once. She remembered the thrill of it, the feeling that she was on the verge of something big, that her life was going to be one of concert halls and applause. But then life had intervened. A sudden illness in her family had brought her rushing back home, back to the quiet rhythms of the countryside. The farm needed help. Her family needed her. The dream of the city began to feel distant and selfish. And then she had met him. Her future husband. He wasn't a musician. He didn't understand the language of crescendos and allegros, but he understood the language of the land, of hard work and loyalty. His love was a solid, steady thing like the ground itself. It felt safe. It felt real. She had chosen him, and she had chosen this life, and she had never truly regretted it. But as she sat there in the moonlight, she understood for the first time that in choosing one dream, she had carefully, deliberately, packed another one away in this dusty bench. She placed the Chopin sheet music on the stand, the paper rustling softly. She looked at her hands again, but this time she didn't see them as clumsy or unfit. She saw them as they were, a part of her journey. She took another deep breath, and this time, when she placed her fingers on the keys, it was with a new sense of purpose. She began to play. The first few bars were hesitant, her fingers fumbling for the notes they once knew so well. The music was halting, full of mistakes. It was like trying to speak a language you hadn't used in 20 years. But she didn't stop. She pushed through the clumsiness, her eyes fixed on the sheet music, her mind willing her fingers to remember. And then, slowly, something began to shift. It wasn't her mind that was leading anymore. It was her hands. It was muscle memory, a ghost living in her calloused fingertips. A phrase that had been stilted suddenly flowed. A transition that had been awkward became smooth. The music began to breathe. It wasn't perfect. The piano was out of tune, and her technique was rusty. But it was happening. The melody of the nocturne filled the small room, a haunting, beautiful sound that seemed to push against the walls, searching for a way out into the night. She closed her eyes, and she was no longer in her living room. She was back in that practice room in the city, playing with all her heart. The music was a current running up her arms, a release of something that had been pent up inside her for so long she had forgotten its name. It was a release of joy, of sorrow, of regret, and of love. It was the sound of the girl she used to be and the woman she had become, all playing together. When the final note faded into the silence, she didn't move. She sat there, her hands resting on the keys, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. The house was still silent, but her world was no longer quiet. It was filled with music. The sun rose the next morning just as it always did, spilling gold across the fields and signaling the start of another day. But for her, everything felt different. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghost of a melody. As she went about her morning chores, her hands, which moved with their usual automatic efficiency, felt new to her. She looked at them as she cracked eggs into a skillet, seeing not just the tools of a farmer's wife, but the instruments that had brought a Chopin nocturne to life in the dead of night. A quiet determination began to grow in her chest, a tiny, stubborn seed that had been planted by the moonlight. And the music, once her husband had left for the fields and the children were on the school bus, the house became hers. Instead of starting the laundry or tending to her garden, she found herself standing before the piano again. In the bright light of day, it looked less like a magical portal and more like what it was, a dusty, old piece of furniture. The doubt crept in, cold and sharp. What was she thinking? Last night was a fluke, a moment of weakness fueled by nostalgia. She was a grown woman with responsibilities, not a schoolgirl chasing a fantasy. She almost turned away, but then she remembered the feeling of the music flowing through her, the sense of coming home to a part of herself she thought was lost forever. She sat down, lifted the lid, and began to play. This time it was not a ghost in her hands, but a real, conscious effort. The first few days were frustrating. Her fingers were stiff and slow, tripping over passages that once felt as easy as breathing. The piano, neglected for so long, had a sour note in the upper register that twanged painfully every time she hit it. But she didn't quit. She started with scales, simple exercises she hadn't done since she was a child, slowly coaxing the muscles in her hands and arms back to life. It became her secret ritual. Every afternoon, while the farm hummed with activity outside her window, she would steal an hour, then two, at the piano. She would wipe the dust from the keys before she started and carefully close the lid when she was done, leaving no trace but the faint, lingering scent of old wood and her own quiet determination. The music began to change, and so did she. The halting, clumsy notes started to connect, forming phrases that wept and sang. The Chopin piece, once a distant memory, was becoming a part of her again. She was no longer just reading the notes on the page. She was feeling them. She was pouring all the unspoken things of her life into the music, the weariness from a long day's work, the fierce, protective love for her children, the quiet contentment she felt watching the sunset with her husband, and the small, persistent ache for the road not taken. The piano was her confidant, the only one who knew the secret language of her heart. She was living two lives now. By day she was the same reliable, smiling woman everyone knew. But in the quiet afternoons she was an artist, reclaiming a piece of her soul one note at a time, one afternoon. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the truck pull up the driveway. The back door slammed shut and she froze, her hands hovering over the keys. It was her husband, coming in early because of a broken piece of machinery. She quickly slammed the piano lid shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. She grabbed a dusting cloth and began furiously wiping the furniture, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked in, his boots covered in dirt, a smear of grease on his cheek. "Hey there," he said, his voice warm and tired. "What was that sound?" "Sounded like you were banging on the old piano." Her mind raced. "Oh, this old thing," she said, trying to make her voice sound light and casual. "I was just dusting." The lid fell shut with a bang. "It's so wobbly." She gave the lid a little shake to demonstrate, hoping he couldn't see how badly her hands were trembling. He nodded, accepting her explanation without a second thought. "Well, that thing's probably just firewood anyway," he said with a good-natured shrug. "I'm gonna grab a coffee. Need to figure out how to fix that blasted tractor." As he walked into the kitchen, she let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Leaning against the piano, she felt a surge of something hot and defiant. Firewood? No, it was so much more than that. In that moment of panic, her secret practice transformed from a private hobby into a mission. She had to show him. She had to show them all. The next day, she found the old flyer for the town fair tucked under a magnet on the refrigerator. With a resolve that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, she drove into town. She parked her truck in front of the general store, where a small table was set up for fair registrations. The woman behind the table, a friendly face she'd known for years, looked up in surprise when she saw her. Well, hello. What can I do for you? Are you entering the pie contest again? Your apple pie is legendary. She took a deep breath. No, not this year, she said, her voice a little shaky. She slid the entry form across the table. I'd like to sign up for the talent show. The woman's eyes widened. The talent show? Really? What are you going to do? I'm going to play the piano. The silence that followed was filled with the woman's unspoken surprise. The whole town knew her as the quiet farmer's wife, not a performer. But she just smiled and took the pen, filling in her name in the neat, simple script she used for everything. The act of writing her name felt like signing a contract with herself. The day of the fair arrived with a blistering heat that baked the dust on the roads. The fairgrounds were a chaotic symphony of sounds and smells. The air was thick with the scent of popcorn, fried dough, and livestock. Children's laughter mingled with the lowing of cows and the squawking of chickens from the barns. It was her world, a world of earth and community, but today she felt like an alien walking through it. Her family was there, her husband excited about the tractor pull and her kids begging for cotton candy, and she played her part, smiling and nodding, all while her stomach was tied in knots. The stage for the talent show was a flatbed truck parked in the middle of the fairgrounds, with a few hay bales scattered in front for seating. The acts were wholesome and simple, just as she knew they would be. A group of little girls in matching cowboy boots performed a clumsy but charming square dance. A young man with a guitar sang a country song, his voice earnest but a bit off-key. The crowd was friendly and polite, but they were distracted, eating hot dogs and chatting with their neighbors. The noise was constant, a low, rumbling hum of conversation and activity that seemed to swallow up the performers. Then, her name was called over the crackling loudspeaker. A fresh wave of panic washed over her. She clutched her sheet music, the paper already damp and wrinkled from her sweaty palms. As she walked towards the truck, she felt hundreds of eyes on her. She saw the curious looks from her neighbors, the surprised expressions on the faces of people who had known her for 20 years, but never knew this part of her existed. She climbed the small wooden steps onto the flatbed, the sun beating down on her head. The simple wooden bench felt wobbly and precarious. She sat down, arranged her music on the stand, and looked out at the crowd. They were a sea of sunburned faces, fanning themselves with paper plates and talking loudly. They weren't expecting anything special. They were just waiting for the next act to finish. She took a deep, shaky breath, the noise of the fair fading into a dull roar in her ears. She was just a farmer's wife on a truck in the middle of a dusty field, about to play a song no one there had ever heard. She sat on the rickety bench, the sun beating down on her head, the heat rising from the flatbed truck in shimmering waves. The sheet music, already limp from the humidity, fluttered in a gentle breeze. She looked out at the sea of faces, a blur of sunburnt cheeks and straw hats. No one was paying attention. A man a few rows back was telling a loud, animated story, his arms waving in the air. Two women were deep in conversation, sharing secrets over a paper cone of French fries. A little girl was crying because she'd dropped her ice cream. This was a mistake. A terrible, foolish mistake. Her heart felt like a trapped bird, beating wildly against her ribs. What was she, a farmer's wife, doing here? About to play a piece of complex classical music to a crowd who wanted fiddles and country songs? She could just stand up, mumble an apology, and walk away. No one would really mind. In fact, most of them probably wouldn't even notice. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found her husband, standing near the front with their children. He had a supportive, slightly confused smile on his face, the kind of look you give when you don't understand what's happening, but you're trying to be a good sport. Her daughter was looking up at him, whispering a question. He just shrugged. Seeing them, a wave of protective shame washed over her. She was about to embarrass them. She was about to make a spectacle of herself. Her fingers felt stiff and clumsy, useless. The piano keys, which had felt so familiar in the quiet of her living room, now seemed foreign and hostile. She closed her eyes, shutting out the noise, the heat, the judging faces. She took a deep breath, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, She saw not the fairgrounds but her living room bathed in moonlight. She remembered the feeling of the music flowing through her, the release, the sense of coming home. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing this for the girl who used to live inside her, the girl who had been silent for too long. This was for her. With that thought, a strange calm settled over her. The trapped bird in her chest went still. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and placed her fingers on the keys. Her right index finger descended, pressing the first note of the Chopin Nocturne. The sound that cut through the humid air was not loud, but it was impossibly clear. It was a single, pure, crystalline note that seemed to pierce through the thick blanket of noise, the chatter, the laughter, the distant roar of the tractor pull. It was a sound so utterly out of place that it demanded attention. It was like finding a perfect, flawless pearl in a handful of dirt. A man who was mid-sentence stopped talking, his mouth hanging open. The woman he was with turned to see what he was looking at. A child who had been tugging on his mother's dress stopped and pointed, his face a mask of wonder. The silence didn't happen all at once. It rippled outwards from the stage like a stone dropped in a pond. One person would stop and listen, then the person next to them would notice, and then the next. The low, rumbling hum of the crowd began to subside. Not fading away, but being actively extinguished by the music that was now beginning to unfold. Her fingers, which had felt so clumsy moments before, began to move with a grace that seemed to belong to someone else. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, full of a deep, aching sadness that everyone in the crowd, regardless of whether they knew a thing about classical music, could feel in their bones. It was the sound of longing, of lost dreams, of a quiet resilience. It was a story, and she was telling it with every note. The transformation in the crowd was complete. The fairgrounds, a moment before a chaotic swirl of activity, were now utterly still. People who had been walking stopped in their tracks. The teenagers by the funnel cake stand put down their phones. The judges at the pie baking contest leaned away from their table, trying to see the source of the sound. A father quietly lifted his young son onto his shoulders so he could see. Every eye was now fixed on the woman in the simple dress. Sitting at the old piano on the back of a truck as she played, she was no longer aware of them. Her world had shrunk to the 88 keys beneath her fingers. She was no longer the nervous farmer's wife or the quiet woman from the market. She was the musician she had once been, and the woman she had become, all at once. Her calloused, work-worn hands, which knew the texture of soil and the heat of a baking dish, now danced with an ethereal lightness. They coaxed a dynamic range from the old, out-of-tune piano that no one thought possible. The music swelled, rising from a whisper to a cry of pure, unadulterated emotion, and then softened again into a melancholic sigh. People began to see her differently. They weren't just hearing music. They were seeing her. They saw the tired lines around her eyes and understood them as a map of her life's journey. They saw her simple, worn dress and saw not a sign of poverty, but of a life lived with purpose and hard work. They saw her hands, so strong and capable, and now saw them as instruments of profound beauty. She was pouring 2 decades of unspoken feelings into the performance, the joy of raising her children, the comfort of her husband's steady love, the weariness of endless chores, and the quiet, persistent ache for the life she had left behind. It was all there in the music. It was the most honest, most vulnerable thing any of them had ever witnessed. Her husband stood frozen, his supportive smile long gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He was looking at the woman he had shared a bed with for 20 years, the woman who made his breakfast and mended his clothes, and he was seeing a complete stranger. Or perhaps he was seeing her for the very first time. He saw a depth in her, a passion, a whole universe of feeling that he had never known existed. He felt a pang of regret for all the times he had seen the piano as just a piece of furniture, for all the times he had missed the look in her eyes that he was only now beginning to understand. The music reached its climax, a cascade of notes that was both heartbreakingly sad and breathtakingly beautiful. It was the sound of a soul laid bare, and then as gently as it had begun, it started to subside. The melody softened, The notes became sparser, more delicate, until finally, her fingers played the last, lingering chord. She held it for a moment, letting the sound hang in the suddenly heavy air, a final, perfect shimmer of sound in the vast silence, and then she lifted her hands from the keys. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was thick with awe, with emotion, with a shared, profound experience. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stood there, under the hot afternoon sun, in the middle of the dusty fairgrounds, held captive by the echo of a farmer's wife's music. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. The last note of the nocturne hung in the air, a single, shimmering thread of sound that seemed to hold the entire world together. It didn't just fade away. It dissolved into the heavy silence, leaving a space that felt more profound than any noise. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. The fairgrounds, a moment before a chaotic symphony of life, were now as still as a photograph. The man with the loud story was frozen, his mouth still slightly agape. The little girl, who had been crying over her ice cream, was now staring, her tears forgotten on her dusty cheeks. The heat of the afternoon sun seemed to intensify, beating down on the silent crowd, on the silent stage, on the woman with her hands resting on the keys, her head bowed. It was a silence that was not empty, but full. Full of awe, of wonder, of a sudden collective understanding that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that didn't belong in a dusty field but had somehow landed there. A gift from another world, then, from the very back of the crowd, where an old man in a worn-out straw hat had been leaning against a fence, a single sound broke the spell. It was the sound of one pair of hands, clapping slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a loud clap, but it was clear and steady. It was a sound of respect. Another person joined in, then another, a spatter of applause that sounded like the first few drops of a coming rain. And then the sky opened up. The applause grew, building from a gentle patter into a thundering, overwhelming roar. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was a wave of sound, a physical force that washed over the flatbed truck. People were on their feet. They were cheering, whistling, their faces alight with an emotion that went far beyond simple appreciation. They were not just applauding a performance. They were acknowledging a soul. They were cheering for the quiet woman they thought they knew, for the hidden dreams they now understood, for the beauty that had been living among them. Unseen, for 20 years, she sat there, stunned as the sound crashed over her. It was a sound she had only ever dreamed of, a sound that belonged to a different life, a different person. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked out at the sea of faces. They were no longer a blur. They were individuals, their eyes shining, their expressions open and full of a warmth she had never received from them before. A tear she hadn't realized was forming escaped and traced a slow, salty path down her cheek. She felt a trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from a release so powerful it felt like her whole body might come apart. She stood up on shaky legs and gave a small, awkward bow. It wasn't the bow of a seasoned performer. It was the bow of a farmer's wife, humble and overwhelmed. Grateful for a moment she never thought she would have, the announcer, a young man who looked just as stunned as the rest of the crowd, walked onto the stage. He took the microphone, his usual cheerful banter gone. "Well," he said, his voice a little shaky, I don't think there's any need for a vote on that one." He fumbled with an envelope, then seemed to remember it didn't matter. "The winner of the talent show and the $50 gift certificate to the farm supply store is, well, it's you." He held out the certificate, a flimsy piece of paper that suddenly seemed ridiculous, insulting. She looked at it, then back at the crowd, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She shook her head gently. "You keep it," she said, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying in the quiet that had followed the applause. "Give it to the kids for their 4-H club?" She didn't need the prize. The roaring silence, the thunderous applause, that was her reward. That was the blue ribbon dot as she stepped down from the truck. The crowd didn't just go back to their business. They parted for her, creating a path. People reached out, not to grab her or to ask for an autograph, but just to touch her arm, to say a few quiet words. An old woman, her face a road map of wrinkles, simply patted her hand and said, "Thank you, dear." "Thank you for that." A burly man with grease under his fingernails just nodded at her, a look of profound respect in his eyes. It wasn't fame she was experiencing. It was connection. She had shared a piece of her soul, and in return they were giving her a piece of theirs. Then she saw them. Her husband, standing with their children, who were bouncing on the balls of their feet, their faces bright with excitement. Her daughter ran to her first, wrapping her arms around her legs. "Mom, that was the most beautiful thing I ever heard. You were like a princess." Her son stood back a little, trying to look cool, but his eyes were shining. "Yeah, Mom," he said, his voice thick with pride. "You were awesome." She looked up at her husband. The confused, supportive smile from before was gone. In its place was an expression she had never seen on his face before, a mixture of awe, love, and a dawning, humbling understanding. He was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, seeing the woman he had married, plus the woman he had never known. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked up to her, his work boots scuffing in the dirt, and took her hand. His hand was rough and familiar, a hand she had held 1,000 times, but this time it felt different. It felt like a promise. "I never knew," he said, his voice quiet and thick with emotion. "I never knew." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a simple, honest admission that opened a door between them that had been closed for 20 years. The ride home was different. The children chattered excitedly in the back seat, reliving every moment of her performance, but she and her husband were quiet. It wasn't the old, comfortable silence of their routine, but a new, vibrant silence, full of things that had been said and things that didn't need to be. Every so often he would glance over at her, a small, soft smile on his lips, and she would squeeze his hand. When they got home, the house felt the same, but it also felt completely different. The piano was still in the corner, but it was no longer a dusty piece of furniture. It was the heart of the room. As the children ran off to tell their grandparents about the show, her husband walked over to the piano. He ran his hand over the top, wiping away a streak of dust with his thumb. He looked at the yellowed keys, then back at her. "Play for me sometime?" he asked. It wasn't a command, but a gentle request, an invitation into her world. She nodded, a new wave of tears welling in her eyes, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. "Every day," she whispered, and she did. The farmer's wife began to play, and this time the silence that followed was not empty or lonely. It was filled with the love of her husband, the pride of her children, and the quiet, joyful sound of a woman who had finally found a way to bring all the pieces of her life together, creating a music that was entirely, beautifully her own.